I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrés Cisneros-Montemayor, who is a resource economist specializing in marine systems and cross-scale developmental policy. Regarding to Andrés, I would say that he's a truly UBC-bred researcher who finished his MSc in 2010, his PhD in 2014, spent several years as a postdoctoral fellow in NERIOS program and Ocean Canada Partnership. And currently he is a research associate in the IF, but also a deputy director of the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus program. An important aspect of his work is to look at the dynamics between commercial and recreational, social and cultural benefits from shared ecosystems. His research touches on optimal economic policies, co-management, transboundary fisheries, ecotourism, and small-scale and indigenous fisheries, always with a view to achieving sustainable resource use in a changing world. So welcome, Andrés.
Thank you, Evgeny. Thanks everyone for being here. It's nice to see familiar names and picture your friendly faces. And for everyone who I don't know, hopefully you'll be into this talk. I actually, let me start sharing my screen for a sec. Screen 2. Yes, that should be working. Some of you might remember that I gave like a similar version of this talk like 2 years ago. I don't know, maybe 3. I don't know, I'm not sure if last year counts or not, but a while ago at a Fish 500 seminar. And at that point, it's funny because it was it's a very much a half-baked idea that I had. And you know, I think seminars are sometimes for that, right? Just sharing, getting feedback and seeing if there was anything to it. And I'm very happy to say this is now accepted. It's impressed a few people that are on the call are co-authors. And so it's been really cool and just super helpful to kind of get everyone's input from the very beginning on it. And I'm really excited to kind of show some of the results and stuff and see sort of what, you know, what we make of them now, because, you know, such a cool part about science is kind of sharing in that back and forth. And, you know, just because something's accepted and it's out there doesn't mean it's the end of the story, right? It's kind of the beginning of it and seeing what we can do to build on it or critique it or whatever. So today I'll be talking about blue economy and how we create the enabling conditions for it to be equitable and sustainable. There we go. The main message of this, if you have to go, if something happens, if you get Zoom bombed, this is the main message. Basically, a new and transformative blue economy has to focus on social equity. And that's something that is, it's part of what was proposed as part of the blue economy term from the very beginning. As I'll mention, it's something that not everyone agrees on at this point, right? There's a lot of different, I guess, conceptions of what blue economy is or should be. But this is kind of my main thesis, if you will. And hopefully what I'll be able to do is show you quantitatively some evidence for kind of supporting this, you know, so this isn't purely a normative statement. Although I will say that I think we're at a stage now in science where, you know, I've often said it now, like, I don't feel like we need to like apologize for caring about equity. And so I won't apologize for caring about equity, but, you know, again, this isn't a purely normative statement. There is a lot of evidence to back this up. And so, you know, first to start a little bit about how the blue economy came around, you know, all of you will be very familiar with a lot of the challenges we have around oceans, right? So pollution and bycatch and illegal fishing, obviously all the issues surrounding climate change and its effects on the oceans are things that you already know really well. And we often can really quantify that. Or I mean, this is some research from actually Vicky, who I think I saw is on there. Awesome on this, Vicky. I use the one from the chapter, but I saw it's now published, and that's really great, where they find that most countries in the world are going to see negative impacts on their fisheries just purely due to temperature changes from climate change, right? So not even sea level rise or storm activity, all these sorts of things, right? So that obviously has a lot of impacts on national and local economies, but sort of beyond that, there are a lot of people that depend really, really deeply on ocean resources beyond just the economics or the commercial aspects of it, right? So this map shows the mean fish consumption by indigenous peoples around the world. This is in kilograms per capita. And one important takeaway from this is obviously that that's really high in certain parts of the world, but also that it's much higher than sort of non-indigenous populations in those same places, right? And so that cultural value and that traditional value is something that we also can't ignore, right? It doesn't mean that only indigenous peoples value the ocean in this way, but it's just kind of one more example of the fact that benefits of oceans go beyond purely commercial ones. And here's an economist saying that. And another aspect of these things that's been talked about a lot recently is due to conflict, right? It's conflicts, labor abuses that happen at sea, and it's sort of like added another layer that I think it always kind of been like, this research isn't necessarily new, but there's definitely a lot of new research that's looking at it from really interesting new perspectives. I put up a reference there to Jessica Spiker's work on this, on conflict, and again, a very much a quantitative perspective on it, which isn't necessarily the end all be all, but it does add a lot of just a different perspective to these sorts of issues, and sort of another layer of reasons why we need to care about these things really, really deeply, because obviously at the root of a lot of these conflicts, obviously the labor abuses, but also the sort of the nation-to-nation conflicts are issues of inequitable distribution of power, of resources, et cetera. And so those sorts of inequities, I've really started to come to the forefront. Thankfully, it took us long enough to get them on the main stage, right? And so now there is a lot more recognition than there used to be for the fact that these sorts of issues of whether it's inequity related to gender or to different sectors or to different nationalities, or imbalances in the economic power of different regions, those are all different parts of inequity, right? And those are all things that we need to address in order to build better oceans, right, for the future. And so you're probably all familiar with the concept of the green economy, which was first proposed at Rio, and then the first formal report was launched at Rio Plus 20. And so the green economy, if you don't know, is basically a concept for the future way that we're going to create our economies, right? So we're very mindful of climate impacts, of environmental impacts, and we can kind of create sustainable economies going forward, right, at a large scale. And so at that same meeting, the term blue economy was proposed by the small island developing states, and sort of as a counterpart to it, where they said, we love this idea of sustainable national economies. A lot of this is based on renewable energy and aquaculture, and sort of land-based renewables. And we don't have a lot of land because we're small islands, but we have a lot of ocean. So we would like to propose this term blue economy to be a counterpart to it. But because a lot of these island states very much continue a lot of their traditions, blue economy was sort of added another layer of equity to it, right? So not just sustainable economies, but culturally appropriate economies and culturally appropriate goals for your development. Okay, and so this term has become super, super common in almost anything you read, right? And so there's a lot of people work on this. We'll say anybody who's asking for any sort of grant internationally now has to include blue economy in there somewhere, because it's kind of the term du jour, right? And so, and there really is a lot of excitement around it. The first Blue Economy Conference was held in Kenya at the end of 2018. I was lucky enough to be invited to a panel there, and there were 18,000 people already there. And think about it, this is only a few years after Blue Economy is sort of coined as a term, and already you see just an enormous amount of interest in this idea of a new way to relate with the ocean. But as often happens, because you have such a wide array of issues around ocean and different challenges associated that we have to address, very quickly there started to be different discourses in what the blue economy should sort of mean, right? What should be prioritized within blue economy? And there's some really cool papers by Michelle Boyer and Jennifer Silver. There's a couple brand new ones that just came out still on this sort of topic that really analyze those discourses and kind of really managed to distill them down. You know, it really does seem like they really hit the nail on the head here and really managed to separate them into ways that we can understand them a little bit better, right? And so the four that they talk about are, you know, oceans as natural capital. The little logos and stuff sort of to the beside the four quadrants are kind of the types of organizations that are pushing these narratives a bit more, or that hold them a bit more. So you have the first, oceans as natural capital, right? So these are kind of economic incentive-based approaches, but very much centered on conservation. Then you have the oceans as a driver of innovation, right? So a lot of interest on, you know, land resources are becoming scarce. The oceans are going to be the future engine of global economic growth. And obviously there's a lot of private interest in that, right? And so those investment opportunities. You have oceans as good business, right? So basically creating more property rights around the ocean, starting to sort of quantify them a little bit better and get a bit more of a handle on how do we account for ocean economies around the world, right? And then finally, oceans as livelihoods that are really thinking more about the employment that is generated by the ocean. One really interesting thing though is that they're very much geared onto sort of the practice of ocean sectors, right? So employment, livelihoods, subsistence, not so much a lot of the cultural aspects associated with it. But anyhow, those are kind of the four that they've identified. And so the issue with a lot of these different perspectives, though, if you notice, is that a lot of them don't specifically address these issues of equity, and so who is counted and who is not in these different things, right? So the discourses are kind of out there, you know, and obviously they're not always that distinct, right? There's a lot of overlaps, but very often they don't explicitly sort of say who they are speaking to or what goals they are most interested in, right? That was a really cool part about Michelle and Jen's work, that they managed to kind of tease that out in their discourse analyses. And so to give you an example of what these things could mean and what the risk for this would be, you know, if you have industries that are really high growth potential and obviously linked to sustainability, like something like renewable energy, those things are usually included, right? And so will it create a lot of jobs? Who knows? But, you know, there's these two big things, right? If you're an investor, you want to get in from the ground floor and you know, hopefully reap that down the line. And obviously you want emissions reduction, so there's a lot of interest around that. At the same time, though, if you have industries like offshore oil and gas drilling, or you know, seabed mineral exploitation, that sort of thing, you know, these sorts of industries have tremendously high profits, high growth potential. Some of them, maybe there's a lot of interest in the seabed mining aspect of it, but obviously they're unsustainable. Right? By definition, you can't sustainably exploit a non-renewable resource. But they're still included, right, because of the other two parts of it. But then you have things like artisanal fishing, right? So where it's very important for livelihoods. It could be sustainable. Some of them aren't, but we definitely have ideas on how to make them sustainable, and there are strategies out there. But they're perceived to have very, very low growth potential, right? So there isn't much as an investor that you're really going to gain from investing in artisanal fisheries. And so these are often actually not included, and they really have to fight hard to include them in these blue economy plans, which seems kind of weird, right? Because your artisanal fisheries are by far the highest employer of in the oceans, right? So again, which discourse you take has very real implications for who is going to be impacted and who's going to benefit from these different industries. And so to kind of take a step back, you know, so when we see these kinds of images of blue economy, there aren't a lot of them out there, but this is a really, really popular one that the World Bank came up with, you know, and it's kind of this like really cool vision of blue economy, right? So very high tech, very well organized and whatnot. But you don't really see the people there, right? And they're not really speaking to those issues of, okay, wait a minute, who's getting the jobs on these like high tech boats? what are the people in that little coastline that we see doing? Are they contributing to this or not? Or did they used to be fishing here or doing other stuff there? And a lot of those things are questions that haven't really been addressed yet. And an additional really important part of all this is that we're not starting from a blank slate, right? So if you look at these things like, oh, cool, yeah, we'll put the wind farms and the, mass tourism there with a cruise ship and maybe some research vessels or whatever. But we already have a lot of ocean activity everywhere. We have for centuries, right? And so this map just shows different existing, wind and tidal energy sites and blue carbon initiatives and bioprospecting, places where bioprospecting happens already, mariculture and tourism. You see all the fisheries map kind of underneath all that. And so this is really not a blank slate, and so for a lot of these sectors, when we think about blue economy, we probably shouldn't be thinking primarily about, these new emerging sectors that we're going to create to be equitable and sustainable. We need to be thinking about how we're going to transform the ones that are already there and that, aren't equitable and aren't sustainable, right? And those are going to be enormously big challenges going forward with all this stuff. Particularly when, as I mentioned at the beginning, we already have incredibly significant impacts all around the world. And talk about invasive species and pollution, slave labor contributing to the food that we eat, in addition to it potentially being unsustainable. And that happens all over the world, right? So south, north. So again, that's why we're saying that if we want to think about blue economy, we have to think about those issues first. There has to be a transformational approach that thinks about social equity. And so one thing that we try to do then is, all right, well, how can we think about the whole thing together? And that was that talk that I gave years ago on starting to think about how we would combine those sorts of things, right? And so we have these kind of four different dimensions, right? So we've got the natural resources. Obviously, these are all, blue economy almost by default. You're thinking about ocean-based sectors, although some will argue freshwater should be part of it too. I'm only looking at oceans for now. So obviously you need resources, right, to do these things. We mentioned that we need to recognize social equity. Well, equity has a lot of different aspects to it, right? There's recognition and inclusion. There's procedural equity and distributional equity. There's different types of access that we have, and so on. When we think about the environment, we're thinking about biodiversity, habitats, ecosystems. There's a lot of different ways to think about environmental sustainability in and of itself. And I'm sure, there's tons and tons of literature and books written about sort of the definitions of sustainability and what components we need to be looking at. And then for economic growth as well, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, right? Are you looking for a payoff on a private investment? Are you a nation making a public investment that's maybe going to pay off in 50 years? How do you think about infrastructure versus corruption versus wider governance versus the banking system? There's a lot of really complicated things here. And so one really neat thing about working with Ocean Nexus and the Nereus program before it is that we have this really amazing interdisciplinary group, right? And people that are experts in these different things and access to a lot of data that we can use to sort of bring in together and hopefully combine in a way that makes sense, right? And it allows us to make sense of this very, very complex issue. And so I'm getting a little bit now into what we actually did, right? And so first of all, we only looked at 6 sectors, right? And so the criteria were that they have to be based on marine living resources, so no oil, no gas, or very explicitly linked to sustainability, right? So like the case of offshore wind, or it can be tidal or wave energy from the ocean, right? Which is very obviously linked to emissions reductions. And so the sectors we looked at were blue carbon, fisheries, ecotourism, so not mass tourism, but ecotourism, mariculture, bioprospecting, and ocean energy, ocean renewable energy. So that, and you can imagine, obviously, we need data on the underlying resources that you would need for each one of these things, right? So I won't get too deep into the message for that, but feel free to ask me later how we're doing it. The second part, though, is all the enabling conditions, right? What allows you to take these resources and these sectors, and actually have them develop in a way that's equitable and sustainable, right? And viable economically, right? You do want to make some money off of this. And so one big guide that we have were the SDGs that you can start to work with, right? And the SDGs, there's a lot of literature critiquing. So each one of these probably has, journals devoted to critiquing it. But it is a nice place to start because they start to set on paper what all governments, that are part of the UN, have agreed are these equity goals, right? So poverty and gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. And there are existing efforts to sort of map out those SDGs and see what some of the relationships are between them and sort of get that idea of like the fact that, SDG 14, which is the one that deals with ocean issues, life below water, is also linked to a lot of these other development issues that are around it, right? And it's both something that you have to achieve in order to get some of the goals, or conversely, you have to achieve some of these other targets before you achieve some of the ocean goals. And we have that mapped out pretty well to give us some of those relationships between enabling conditions that are sort of environmental versus, human and social. And so in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is create this blue economy capacity, quote unquote, index, right? And so you have these two major components. You have the resource availability. Do you have the resource to do a sector? And then you have the enabling conditions, right? So do you have the conditions currently in place so that that sector can be developed or implemented in a way that's equitable, sustainable, and viable? And so we use a fuzzy logic approach to sort of combine those things. In a second, I'll show you kind of a little bit more broken down the kind of indicators that we're putting into this. But again, just kind of taking baby steps towards it, because then I often also get confused and have to like go back. So again, we have this blue economy capacity, and then you have these four things around it, right? So you have the resource availability, social equity conditions, environmental sustainability conditions, and economic viability conditions, right? Each one of those four has a set of indicators. I think you can see my arrow. Has a set of indicators that contribute to different criteria within them. And then those contribute to these four dimensions. And then that gets together in this final kind of index of blue economy capacity. And so this is kind of what that looks like, sort of more blown up, right? So you've got blue economy capacity in the middle. You've got your dimensions, resource availability, social equity, economic viability, and environmental sustainability around it. And then you have these different criteria, right? Because again, remember, there's a lot of different aspects to these things, right? So if you think about resource availability, those criteria would be the 6 sectors that we chose, right? So by prospecting, blue carbon, ecotourism, fisheries, mariculture, ocean energy, each one of those has a bunch of indicators that feed into it, depending on what we need, right? So for one example, for ocean energy, if you're thinking about offshore wind energy, well, first you need wind. So you need a layer of wind speed, or current if you're doing tidal or wave energy. But 2 other things that are really, really important are depth and distance from shore, right? Because there's a lot of technical limitations. So you could have a lot of wind speed out in the middle of the ocean, for how you're going to get that energy to where it's actually needed, right? To the cities. It's way too far. Or if you're even right off the coast, but it's super, super deep, how are you going to put up your wind turbines? And obviously there are some technological advancements to have them be floating or whatever, but we're only looking at current tech for all these things. And so this will be important for results. So just remember that we take the indicators, we're evaluating them based on that fuzzy logic approach on their contribution to whether you have, in a nutshell, sort of low capacity, medium capacity, or high capacity for each one of these sectors. And then those are evaluated in terms of resource availability, right? So this encompasses these 6. And then blue economy capacity encompasses all 4 of the dimensions, right? So we have scores at each level of this. And so I won't dwell too much on this one. Basically what I said before, it's really nice to be able to work with a huge interdisciplinary team that has access to a ton of amazing information. Thank you to a lot of people on this call actually for it. And so, so you combine all these layers. There's 30 something sectors on layers of data on this. And so that represents our input, right? And everything's a half degree by half degree cell. And so this is what we get. If you only look at resource availability, and this is what a lot of there's not a lot of global work on this. I guess we should publish this part because I don't think this is out there anyway. But anyway, most people are only looking at resource availability, usually at the regional scale, right? So what resources do we have in the Caribbean to implement some of these sectors, right? And so that'll give you this kind of map, right? And so I'm not going to give you the broken down one of each one of the sectors, but essentially the really key thing to take away from this is that resources are distributed all around the world, but they're very patchy, right? So there's only a very few places around the world that you actually have the necessary resources to competitively develop a whole bunch of sectors at the same time, right? So most of the time you really realistically are going to have to choose one or two that you're actually able to develop competitively. And the second really important takeaway, that it's funny, it should have been absolutely obvious when I say it about this, that it's so complicated that it's hard to visualize before you get the results, which is nice because it's kind of fresh to you too. But the vast majority of potential is right along the coast, right? And again, this goes back to the depth requirements, or if it's blue carbon, that's where the vegetated systems are. If it's fisheries, a lot of them operate very close to shore. And so again, this is really important because, we talk about blue economy. Yes, we're going to need to have a lot of multilateral collaboration. That's really, really key. But a lot of the resources are within the EEZs, right, where there is a lot of jurisdictional responsibility for the social issues that are going to come up as really key here. This shows the same sort of thing, but this kind of pulls together equity, viability, and sustainability. Okay, and these are sort of those enabling conditions as a whole. And so you can see some of the red spots and the blue spots in this. The really interesting thing about this, though, is that within each region, there's a ton of variation, right? And so again, when you're thinking about the regional approaches, you have to be really mindful of the fact that, Caribbean is one good example, right? So look at the variation here between these different enabling conditions, right? And so now you have to start thinking about that when you're trying to develop as a region a lot of these resources. Even in the places where you have these larger coastlines, obviously a lot of this data that you have, especially on these equity and viability information, is at the national level, right? So we need to start getting better local data because, as we know, sort of the international capacity, governance capacity, if you want to think about it that way, can be incredibly variable, right? And so this is kind of like this is a global perspective, but it's really important that we look more deeply if we're using this for any sort of planning. And this kind of shows you the interplay between those two things, right? So on the y-axis, you have the resource availability score. All the scores are 0 to 100. On the x, you have the enabling conditions. Again, that's sort of all three together. And it just kind of shows how it can pull you either way, right? And so you can have two countries that have really, really high resource availability can have very, very different blue economy capacities, right? Which is this color scale, right? So these have blue ones and these kind of lower yellowish brown ones. And so if you look at across development category, the interesting thing is you get a lot of variation, right? So there obviously is a relationship between the enabling conditions in a development category. This is a UN development category, right? So HDI based, basically. And so as you would expect, right? So we're tracking similar things, even if we're not using the HDI directly. But there isn't any relationship between blue economy capacity, okay, or at least not a significant one, and the resource availability score, right? And so you could have these things if you invested in these enabling conditions. And so again, if we overlay this whole thing, it kind of gives you a different picture of where these capacities are. But the important thing and this is really, really an interesting result, are that if you try to explain the differences between different jurisdictions in terms of blue economy capacity, these are in order of how well they explain. These are different criteria. the ones that explain the differences the most are human rights, corruption, and national stability, right? So not fisheries or ecotourism or bioprospecting potential, blue carbon, any of that, right? They obviously contribute a little bit, but these three are by far the ones that contribute the most. And the important thing for me is that those three things are things that we can actually invest in, right? So we can't, it's very, very difficult in the short term to make more mangrove, maybe in 20 years, and who knows with climate change, but I can invest in ensuring that human rights are respected, in combating corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we get there? It's tough, but I think there are a lot of interesting things that are sort of coming up on the horizon. One is that we need to really embrace and prioritize equity and well-being. I said at the beginning that, I think we're at the point where nobody should have to apologize for being, interested in these things, right? It doesn't matter if you're a natural science or a social scientist. And you start to see that in a lot of these different initiatives, right? So, if you guys are familiar with the recent high-level panel reports, there were several of them actually that focused on human and social or equity issues, right? I was lucky enough to be invited to contribute to a couple of them. And so a lot of the issues are much more on the forefront. I would definitely not say that they are at the top of the priority list for policymakers. It's still a lot to do with conservation and, sort of economic growth, I guess. But to see them there, I think it is an advance towards it. The second part is that we really need to think about how we conceptualize equity in ocean governance, right? And who we're inviting to the table in a lot of these different things, and think about that really explicitly. This is a figure from a really cool study led by Mario Vieros that came out late last year. And so what this shows you is the little tracks in there. Hopefully you can read this is big enough on your computers. But the little, these tracks are tagging data for different species, right? So these are from turtles, these are from albatrosses, and these are from fur seals. And so you can see, obviously, they straddle all over the high seas and different coastlines. And all the little black points here are places where there are currently indigenous communities, and so the main argument in this paper was that, indigenous communities should have a voice in how we manage biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. Right? And so the argument against them being there is like, well, you're not on the high seas. These are just for like people that are using stuff on the high seas. But they absolutely are linked culturally, commercially, traditionally, everything to species that straddle across the high seas, and they've been managing them for sometimes thousands of years. And so we need to think about these people and how these sorts of decisions affect them as well. Similarly, this is a paper by Nathan Bennett, and now that's also really, really interesting, because basically his argument there is basically when you have your interventions for improving management, even there you can start to think about redressing historical injustices on these sorts of things, on artisanal fisheries or indigenous fisheries, right? So you could have this top example. We have a historical fishery that was maybe originally subsistence and small scale. You have the large scale coming in, the fishery collapses, and then when you intervene, you can actually make a choice, and you can say, okay, well, do we want to recover this fishery and maintain the current share of catches, or do we actually want to think about restorative justice and sort of restore the share of catches to what they were at some point in time historically, in a way that actually contributes more to some of those communities? And so we really need to change the narrative of transformation. The slogan of the SDGs is no one must be left behind. And I think that gets a little bit lost, right? So that means we need to really think about people that are the most vulnerable to these things and do it whenever we do our work. There's a lot of examples of this around the world that are slowly starting to gain a little bit of traction. So for example, there's a lot of different collaborative partnerships between indigenous peoples or developing countries, least developed countries, in having a say in sort of these regional approaches to development, and a say not only in like what data gets used, which is important, but also what goals are we actually pursuing in these things, and that's really important. There's a lot of talk in the climate change goals and literature now, or more talk than there used to be, about equity and how we establish sort of areas that we're going to protect, or who's going to benefit from these different habitat restoration plans, who benefits from ecotourism. And so I think there are things that are happening out there, but everything just points to this main message, right? So we have to focus on social equity. We have to sort of turn that wedding cake model on its head, right? So, traditionally we thought if we could only get the environment fixed, then we could grow the economy and people would be happy. I think we really need to turn that on its head, right? So if we can really address the social issues that are at the root of a lot of these environmental problems, then maybe we'll get to the environment, right? And we can do it together for sure, but we have to be thinking about what those underlying social inequities and problems are. And I had a really nice meeting with a student, Anna, yesterday, and from this, actually, this is totally her idea. I was like, oh, this is really cool. So it's just more thinking about specifically within the IOF and for students, right? So what can they do? Like, what can we do as we move forward? The first one is to really carefully consider equity in our methods and our recommendations, right? So even if you're natural science, just taking a step back and thinking, okay, well, what are sort of the equity implications of the way that I'm planning to do my science, or the questions that I'm asking, or whatever I'm recommending after I do my science? I think that's really important. Another thing is that we have to really embrace, obviously, a diversity of peoples, as we all know, but also diversity of ideas, right? We have to really listen to ideas that we may not agree with. And that's also really important to kind of get a better sense of different perspectives that are out there. A really important one, I think, that I've really learned to do is to really seek out social scientists, right? I mean, most of us have more of a natural science training, and it's awesome that we're thinking about these sorts of things, right? But there's an enormous scholarship around these issues that we can draw from. And one first step, obviously, yes, seek out the papers and read them and the books, but it can be as easy as seeking out a social scientist and asking them what they think about the stuff that we're doing, right? And then finally, we always have to question the past strategies, right? So past strategies that we've used are not necessarily the best ones, right? And so we always have to think about them and try and propose ones that make more sense in today's context, or in whatever context that we're working in through our work. And so that is it for me. Yes, I was planning for like a little bit of time for discussion, because I know Zoom is kind of like, I don't know, just it's so awkward for the discussions. But so that's great. Huge thanks to everyone for being here, and especially to the collaborators on this work, because obviously they know we couldn't do this unless we're all kind of in it together. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrés, for this great presentation. On the side note, congratulations, Nicolas, for his defense, which was at the same time.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I guess he's probably not here, but felicidades, Nicolas.
And we have a first question from Roshni. Roshni, if you could put your camera and ask the question to Andrés. And for other people, please post your question on the chat box.
So Gabriel, you're just going to be moderating the questions, right? I'll just
yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It's super interesting. Sorry, my internet's not very good, so I can't turn on my camera.
No problem. That's no problem.
Yeah, I was wondering how you ended up with all the indicators. How did you gather all of them up? And because it's such a wide spread of them, so how did you get all of those together?
You mean like the data or the integration?
Like the indicators that you had for when you were defining the capacity for the blue economy. There was so many of them, and I was wondering, where did you look to accumulate all of those indicators?
So I looked at a lot of places, and I should probably saying like, this is now accepted, but this was like, it took 3 years to put this all together, right? And so basically just time and effort is the best answer that I can give. But a lot of it really coming from those recommendations that I gave at the end, right? So things where, you start reading about these things, and for example, like inequity. Okay, well, what does equity mean? There's a whole literature out there on different perspectives of it. Okay, well, who can we ask that can suggest some ways that we can actually incorporate that sort of thing, and so so that would be one example, right, of reaching out to social scientists and trying to learn as much as you can and really select the ones that make the most sense to people that are experts in that. A lot of the natural science ones, just from my own background, like a lot of the tourism and fisheries, obviously we have so much capacity at IOF. And so I had done a lot of work before, sort of before blue economy was blue economy. And always, like a lot of my work has always been thinking about how do we support development that is equitable and sustainable in some of these different sectors, right? So we had already done sort of very deep sectoral dives or reviews of multi-sectors and stuff. So we had a lot of that to work with. But at the end of the day, it took a long time.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Tony Farrell, who raised his hand.
Yeah, great, Andres. Wonderful high view. I unfortunately live in Canada, and I just travel around the world, and I'm more concerned with what's going on in Canada. You may or may not be aware that the federal government is promoting the blue economy now. And I think that this is a fantastic opportunity to reshape the way we do this. And I think that just yesterday we had the Premier of British Columbia lambasting the Prime Minister. The federal government took action in discovery without consulting us at all. Clearly, we have a problem surrounding aquaculture in British Columbia, and we now in a situation where it's federal responsibility, not provincial responsibility in terms of the water. You've identified 3 top priorities of human rights, corruption, and national stability. I would argue that the federal government taking unilateral actions is national stability, which is causing instability. So I'm just at a mismatch here, because what I would like you to do is tell me what pieces of advice you would give to the federal government, who is in charge of our oceans, to create a blue economy in British Columbia.
Thanks, Tony. So I think I think really the most important piece of advice, just for your question specifically, is that they need to start not only consulting with local communities in British Columbia, but actively allowing them to create some of these visions for what they want to see. So as far as I understand it, it's pretty incipient still, but from what I've been able to gather, a lot of the Canadian plan is built still sort of like on a little bit older notions of what the blue economy can be, right? So it's still very much based on oil. I was very worried that shipping through the Arctic is one of the big things. So wait a minute, we should be concerned about the Arctic. It's like melting and people are losing their livelihoods and cultures, right? And so, and I think those things would not happen in that way if they were really taken into account local communities. And again, not only consulting, but allowing them to meaningfully set some of those agendas that we want to see. That would be my main piece of advice.
Do you think that some of the decision processes should devolve to local communities? And I mean, in this regard, I think about area-based management. I feel Indigenous groups should have a bigger voice. And I think that decisions about what works in local communities, such as they've used in Norway with their aquaculture regions, is a great way. And of course, some of this was actually recommended by the independent expert on agricultural science report, and it just seems to have been ignored.
No, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely, we should devolve some of this stuff. I mean, the oceans are difficult because there's so much connectivity just by virtue of ocean currents and stuff, right? So you're always going to have to, you'll always need some sort of like integration plan, right? I think more than in terrestrial systems. But that doesn't mean that you can't devolve some of the decision making of sort of what goals we're actually trying to achieve in some of the communities, for sure. I absolutely agree with that.
Okay. Thanks very much. Great.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
We have a question from David Rosen. So David, if you can put.
Yeah, thanks. You sort of touched on it towards the end of your explanation with Tony, but it seems to me that the aquatic frontier is sort of a Wild West thing, and the blue economy seems a way of doing it rationally and equitably would be the key word.
Mm-hmm.
That it seems to me, as an outsider, and I was curious whether you find this, that it's in a way it's more difficult to impose some sort of social structure on how the oceans are developed, just because so much of it is transboundary. So you can't necessarily have independent innovations by certain nations or certain areas, because if, for example, a fish stock is going between nation A and nation B, there's that problem of the commons. And is that something that even at the level you're addressing that you have to consider?
Yeah, so I'm not, that's a really, really excellent point. I didn't include transboundary issues here. And I think those are definitely very important to consider for oceans as opposed to other places. But there are a couple of things though, so one is that, I kind of disagree with that notion of the ocean as a Wild West, right? The ocean has been used for thousands of years by a lot of different cultures in a lot of different ways, right? So a lot of the sectors are actually quite well established. And actually the challenge is how we're going to transform them to become equitable. And in a similar way, there are a lot of existing regulations, maybe not on the high seas, but for the most part on the coastlines, right? There's all manner of regulations. The problem is that they're not really being followed. And so I definitely agree with your point then that the important thing for a blue economy then is not really to sort of set a radical new way in which we govern oceans, but to center what we're doing on equity, right? And have that be kind of like a guide of how we implement a lot of these things. And that, which brings me to one of the main other results that I talked about, which is even though these transboundary issues are incredibly important for sure, and global issues, especially climate change, right, is the main one. As I said before, the vast majority of the resources are within EEZs and very close to the coast, right? So yes, there are going to be a lot of stocks that we're going to need transboundary cooperation and climate change and all this sort of thing. But there also is a lot of stuff that we can do nationally, or hopefully sort of subnationally, to improve our blue economies, right? So I think that's sort of that local, the local aspects of a blue economy, I think, are ones that are really, really important to recognize. In terms of they're kind of a little bit lost in the shuffle with the global perspective on blue economy. If that makes sense.
We have a question from Spencer Charissen. Jason,
Chesson, however you want to say it. Fantastic talk. I'm in a course right now with Rashid, and I'm writing a paper on kelp farming. And the more I read about it, the more interesting it is to me, through so many different ways, especially through equity. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the future and place of kelp farming in the blue economy globally and specifically in Canada?
Well, you're the one writing a paper on it. You should tell me.
I just started. Also, yeah. Good point. Okay.
No, sorry. No. I mean, honestly, I don't know a whole lot about kelp farming specifically. I mean, what I do know is that a lot of the sort of these more kind of more open water mariculture type initiatives around the world, like one of the big equity, there's sort of like a double-edged sword in them, right? Because a lot of them are like, well, if they're in that place, then you can definitely take more of that local approach, right? So a local community can take ownership over it and sort of sharing its benefits and take care of it or whatever, which I think is really important, right? There's a lot of these initiatives in Japan, which has the longest history. Well, maybe other parts in Asia, but anyway, Japan has a very long history of kelp farming. It's still very important for local communities. On the other hand, though, is what David was mentioning, right? At the same time, you're really exposed to a lot of these kind of wider impacts in the ocean, right? And so I think what there needs to be is much more of an explicit recognition at the high level of the impacts that those high level decisions have on the local level, right? Because if we're gonna encourage and support people to take some of those initiatives like kelp, which is cool because it can be used for a lot of things, right? You can use it for sort of industrial applications or for food, or there's some thought that it can be used for like carbon sequestration, which is, is really cool. But if we're going to support that sort of thing, then we also need to make sure that we're working on our end at the high level so that climate change or big storms or whatever doesn't wipe out these local initiatives, right? Because then, we're kind of lying to people by saying that they can take ownership over their own little stretch of ocean and sharing the benefits and feel that cultural attachment if there's going to be this high level stressor that they can't do anything about, right? And so I think that's really the key thing that I would say to this particular question. And again, I'm not a kelp expert, but I think it's sort of your question, I think is really, really important for a lot of these other types of local initiatives, right? So we need to support them, but we need to support them for real, not just kind of applauding and then kind of letting them do their own thing, you know what I mean?
And
Thank you so much.
And we have a last question from David Williams.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, I noticed that equity indicators came out as highly important for blue economy capacity, but I'm interested in the relationship between wealthier countries or countries in the global north and countries in the global south, and like if there's sort of almost like with how climate change, there's kind of a moral duty, some would argue, of countries in the global north to support countries in the global south because of a history of exploitation or colonialism, et cetera. So similarly for, where some countries in the global north that would have a high blue economy capacity because they have low corruption or high stability, to what extent might that come at the cost of other nations, or they might pursue international interests that exacerbate instability in other nations. And so I'm curious of the role of environmental equity researchers to examine these kinds of international governance issues, I guess both from a moral, but also like what kinds of questions would really get at some of that, like how geopolitics influences the distribution of, like, in this case, like blue economy capacity. Simple, right?
Yeah, I know, huh? As someone from the global south, yes, absolutely, there needs to be restitution. I think, if I understood your question correctly, you're basically saying, how do we avoid countries in the global north, as they're investing in these things, having more impacts on the global south? Is that right?
Yeah, and I guess like what kinds of questions should we research to like uncover how maybe existing inequalities like are exacerbated
Right.
or like maintained? It's all lovely to talk about this, but
yeah.
How do we create like quantitative research that points to the role of certain actors that might be exacerbating or maintaining inequality?
Yeah. No, so that is actually a really, really big field, obviously, which I'm not an expert on that field in particular, but there is a lot of research showing or kind of exploring how these high-level decisions, which historically and still currently are often led by countries that are already developed, impact countries that are not yet developed, right? And so I think really the first thing to do is, I keep coming back to the same thing, right? But the first thing to do is to really think about how those decisions are impacting equity outcomes, right? So to give you an example from the ocean, there's now more and more literature on how marine protected areas can benefit or not local communities in the developing world, right? And there's a huge scholarship on sort of, obviously MPAs come from the conservation goals primarily. There's some other things that have been thrown in the mix, but primarily that's where they're coming from. And it's the way that you implement them can bring benefits or can actually exacerbate inequality or poverty in local communities, right? Whether in the north or the south, right? And so there's a lot of scholarship on that, and sort of the means of implementation is a really important one. And also there's a lot of research on kind of the role of regulations given the current inequities in power across the world, and how they can serve to impact different countries if we're not careful, right? So for example, if you put in like really strict pollution regulations in a country, a developed country, will factories just move into a developing country that doesn't have those regulations and start polluting there? And there's a lot of literature on that as well that you could check out. And there's evidence to show that this happens, right? So, so yeah, I mean, I don't know how better to answer it. I mean, I guess my answer is that we need to consciously and explicitly and actively look at these issues, collect that data, examine past histories, because this stuff isn't new, right? Like this isn't the first time that we've developed, sectors and wondered what happens to developing and developed countries. Or we can look to the history of agriculture and manufacturing and a whole bunch of the stuff before. Right? And so I guess my recommendation, if you're interested in that stuff, is take a deep dive into that literature and talk to people that study this sort of thing. So the regulations literature, the environmental justice literature. And I think there we can learn a lot of things for the oceans, right? And so again, the oceans are much more connected generally than a lot of other systems. But the social issues at the root of them aren't specific to the ocean, right? So marginalization, whether it's indigenous or non-indigenous people, happens in a lot of places. Gender and racial biases and migration issues happen in a lot of places. There's an enormous literature, for example, on sort of the just distributions of benefits in waterways, for example, right? So you can have rivers that cut across all manner of different development categories, right? And there's ways to examine what the impacts are of different arrangements. And so in a nutshell, the important thing is that we look, right? That we care about these things, and we actually look and try and see what the effects were.
Okay, I think I have to wrap it up, and I would like to thank on behalf of the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, Andrés, for his excellent presentation.